The morning fog had not yet lifted from the hills of Morazan when the soldiers came down into the hamlet of El Mozote. It was December 11th, 1981, and a 9-year-old girl named Marta Pichinte would later tell researchers that she remembered the sound most of all. Boots on packed earth, and then her mother's hand tightening around hers so hard it hurt. The soldiers separated the men from the women, and the women from the children. Some of the children were led into a small wooden building near the church. A survivor who escaped by hiding beneath the bodies of her own family later testified that she heard the youngest ones inside that building crying out for their mothers, calling names into a silence that would not answer them. Her name was Rufina Amaya, and for years afterward, whenever she told her story to journalists, human rights investigators, and eventually a United Nations Truth Commission, she said the same haunting detail, that she could still hear her own daughter's voice calling Mama, even after she knew, with the certainty that only a mother can carry, that the child was already gone. Rufina survived by crawling into the underbrush and lying motionless for hours, listening to gunfire and the screams of people she had known her entire life. When soldiers finally moved on, she walked for days through the mountains, alone, carrying nothing but the knowledge of what she had witnessed, and the terrible responsibility of being the one left to tell it. This is the story of what happened to young girls caught inside the wars the United States found itself entangled in during the early 1980s, not as headlines or geopolitical footnotes, but as flesh and blood children whose lives were reshaped, and in far too many cases ended, by conflicts they never chose and could not possibly have understood. If stories like these move you, I'd encourage you to stick with this documentary to the end, and if you believe history like this deserves to be remembered accurately, consider subscribing so more of these carefully researched stories can reach people who need to hear them. To understand how a 9-year-old girl in a remote Salvadoran hamlet became caught in the machinery of war, we have to step back and look at the wider picture, though only briefly, because this story belongs to the girls who lived it, not to the men who made the decisions. By 1980, El Salvador had descended into a brutal civil war between the US-backed military government and leftist guerrilla forces known as the FMLN. The Reagan administration, deeply concerned about the spread of Soviet and Cuban-aligned movements in Central America, poured hundreds of millions of dollars in military aid into El Salvador during this period, and American Army advisors trained Salvadoran battalions, including one known as the Atlacatl Battalion. The same unit later identified by investigators as responsible for what happened at El Mozote. This was, historians widely agree, one of the largest massacres in modern Latin American history, and it occurred in a country whose army was trained, funded, and equipped in significant part by the United States. The UN Truth Commission for El Salvador, established as part of the 1992 peace accords, later confirmed that between 700 and 1,000 civilians were killed in El Mozote and surrounding villages over those few days in December 1981. More than half of the identified victims were children. It is easy, when speaking in these large numbers, to lose the individual child inside the statistic. So let's slow down, because that is exactly what happened to the youngest victims of this war. Their individuality, their names, their small daily lives were nearly erased entirely. It took forensic anthropologists from the Argentine Forensic Anthropology team working in the early 1990s to excavate the site and begin the slow, painstaking work of identifying who these children actually were. Using dental records, bone measurements, and testimony from surviving family members, they determined that the average age of the child victims recovered from the site was around 6 years old. Tiny shoes, buttons from dresses, and fragments of toys were cataloged alongside skeletal remains. One forensic report noted the recovery of a rosary still wrapped around small finger bones. These are not details included for shock. but because historians and human rights researchers have argued that this physical evidence was essential in finally forcing acknowledgement of what had happened, acknowledgement that had been denied, delayed, and politically inconvenient for years. If you're finding this history as important as I do, take a moment to hit like on this video. It genuinely helps more people discover stories that deserve to be remembered, not buried. For the girls who survived El Mozote and the broader violence sweeping the Salvadoran countryside throughout the early 1980s, survival did not mean safety. It meant displacement. Hundreds of thousands of Salvadorans fled north into Honduras throughout 1981 and 1982, and many ended up in refugee camps such as Mesa Grande and Colomoncagua, which were administered under the protection of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. Life in these camps has been documented extensively by humanitarian workers, journalists, and later by academic researchers studying the long-term psychological effects of wartime displacement on children. Girls who arrived at these camps frequently arrived without parents, having become separated during chaotic flights through mountain terrain, river crossings, and nighttime marches meant to avoid military patrols. UNHCR records from this period describe overcrowded conditions, chronic malnutrition, and the constant fear that Honduran or Salvadoran military incursions might reach even these supposedly protected spaces, a fear that was not unfounded, as cross-border raids into refugee settlements were documented by human rights observers during this era. Aid workers stationed in these camps, including staff from Médecins Sans Frontières and various church-affiliated relief organizations, kept records and diaries describing the particular vulnerability of unaccompanied girls. Many took on caregiving responsibilities far beyond their years, looking after younger siblings or unrelated orphan children because there was simply no one else to do it. One aid worker's account, later published in a compiled oral history of the Salvadoran refugee crisis, described watching a girl no older than 11 boil water and portion out food for 4 younger children each night, performing the role of a mother because her own mother had not made it out of the mountains. This kind of premature, war-imposed adulthood is something historians and psychologists studying refugee populations from this era have identified again and again. Childhood itself became a casualty of the conflict, quietly and without a single bullet being fired. There is something else that emerged from these camps that deserves to be remembered. Not only suffering, but a remarkable form of resilience and testimony. Women and older girls in camps like Mesa Grande began creating small, brightly colored fabric panels known as arpillaris, stitching scenes of the massacres, the flight through the mountains, and camp life itself directly into cloth. These textile artworks, many of which survive today in archives and museum collections, became a way of preserving memory and communicating what words alone could not fully capture, especially for girls who had witnessed things no child should witness and had no other outlet through which to process it. Historians studying these arpilleras have noted how often they depict, in simple stitched imagery, soldiers burning homes and mothers clutching children, a visual record created by the very people who lived through the events, functioning almost as testimony in thread. Before we continue, if this kind of grounded, well-researched history is something you value, I genuinely appreciate you sharing this documentary with someone who loves history as much as you do. Word of mouth is what keeps stories like this alive. While El Salvador represents perhaps the most extensively documented case of young girls affected by a US-involved conflict in this specific period, it was not the only theater where American military and political involvement intersected with the lives of children caught in war. In neighboring Nicaragua, the United States government backed and funded the Contra rebels fighting against the Sandinista government throughout the early 1980s, a policy that later became the center of significant political and legal controversy in the United States itself. Human rights organizations, including America's Watch, documented attacks by Contra forces on rural communities, schools, and health clinics, attacks that frequently affected children directly, either through violence or through the destruction of the very infrastructure, schools, clinics, agricultural cooperatives, that Nicaraguan girls depended on for education and basic survival. Sandinista literacy campaigns, which had brought many rural girls into classrooms for the first time in the country's history, were disrupted as Contra attacks specifically targeted rural teachers and educational infrastructure, a pattern extensively documented by both the Sandinista government and independent human rights monitors of the period. Further away in Lebanon, American Marines were deployed in 1982 as part of a multinational peacekeeping force following Israel's invasion of that country, a deployment that placed American military personnel in close proximity to some of the most devastating civilian violence of the era, including the massacres at the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps in September 1982, carried out by a Lebanese Christian militia while Israeli forces controlled the surrounding area. While the killings themselves were not carried out by American forces, the United States' diplomatic and military role in the broader Lebanese conflict, and the presence of U.S. Marines as peacekeepers, both before and after the massacre, place this tragedy within the wider story of how American foreign policy intersected with civilian suffering during this period. Palestinian and Lebanese girls living in and around these camps experienced displacement, loss of family members, and long-term psychological trauma that has been documented by researchers studying Palestinian refugee populations in Lebanon for decades since. Survivor accounts collected by journalists in the immediate aftermath described girls as young as 7, witnessing the deaths of parents and siblings, and refugee camp conditions in Lebanon throughout this period were marked by the same overcrowding, malnutrition, and educational disruption seen in Central America, though shaped by the particular circumstances of the Lebanese Civil War and the broader Arab-Israeli conflict. It's worth pausing here to acknowledge how difficult and how important it is to hold multiple perspectives in view when discussing conflicts like these. Historians continue to debate the precise degree of American responsibility in various incidents from this period, and honest documentary work requires acknowledging that complexity rather than flattening it. What is not in dispute, however, documented consistently across UN reports, human rights investigations, and survivor testimony, is that young girls across these conflicts experienced strikingly similar forms of harm: displacement from their homes, interruption or complete loss of education, forced early adulthood through caregiving responsibilities, malnutrition, and profound psychological trauma that researchers have tracked well into these individuals' adult lives. If you're comfortable doing so, I'd love to hear in the comments which part of this story affected you most. These historical documentaries are made richer by the conversations they spark. The psychological consequences of this trauma have been the subject of extensive academic research in the decades since. Longitudinal studies of Salvadoran and Nicaraguan refugee populations, conducted by researchers in psychology and public health throughout the 1990s and 2000s, found elevated and persistent rates of post-traumatic stress symptoms among individuals who had experienced displacement or violence as children during this period, with some studies specifically noting that girls who had lost parents or witnessed extreme violence showed particularly pronounced long-term effects, including difficulties with trust, chronic anxiety, and complicated relationships with their own children later in life. Researchers working with Salvadoran refugee communities that eventually resettled in the United States, particularly in Los Angeles, documented these effects among the very girls who had survived camps like Mesa Grande and Colomoncagua, now grown into women raising families of their own, while still carrying the weight of what they had witnessed decades earlier. And yet, Threaded through all of this documented suffering is an equally well-documented thread of resilience. Rufina Amaya, the woman who survived El Mozote by hiding among the underbrush, spent the remaining decades of her life as a witness, testifying to journalists, to the Truth Commission, to anyone who would listen, insisting that the world know what had happened to her children and her neighbors. She died in 2007, but her testimony remains one of the central pillars of historical understanding of the massacre, cited in academic works, journalistic investigations including Mark Danner's extensively researched account of the massacre, and the official UN Truth Commission report itself. Her insistence on being heard, on refusing to let the deaths of the children in that small wooden building be forgotten or denied, is itself a form of resilience that historians studying wartime memory have come to see as profoundly significant: the refusal to let atrocity be erased. Similarly, the girls who grew up in refugee camps like Mesa Grande, who took on the burdens of caregiving and survival far too young, went on in many documented cases to become community organizers, educators, and advocates within Salvadoran diaspora communities, channeling what they had lived through into work that helped others process similar trauma. Researchers studying these communities have specifically noted this pattern of survivors transforming personal suffering into community resilience, a pattern that appears again and again in the historical record of refugee populations from this era. Before we bring this story to a close, if you've made it this far, thank you, genuinely. Documentaries like this take considerable research to get right, and having viewers who care enough to sit with difficult history all the way through is what makes that effort worthwhile. What happened to young girls in the conflicts touched by American foreign policy in the early 1980s is not a single story with a single lesson, but a collection of documented, verified human experiences that deserve to be remembered with precision and care, rather than exaggeration or political convenience. Marta Pichinte, who survived El Mozote as a 9-year-old, grew up to share her memories with researchers so that the historical record would remain accurate. Rufina Amaya spent her life ensuring the world could not look away. The girls of Mesa Grande stitched their memories into cloth because words were not always enough. The children of Sabra and Shatila and the rural girls of Nicaragua whose schools were destroyed mid-lesson carried their own testimonies forward in whatever forms were available to them. None of these stories are footnotes. Each one is a documented piece of a larger historical truth about how geopolitical decisions made in distant capitals reshape, disrupt, and sometimes destroy the ordinary childhoods of girls who had no say in any of it. Remembering these stories accurately matters, not to assign simple blame or to flatten complicated history into easy narratives, but because these girls lived through something real, and the historical record, through Truth Commission findings, forensic exhumations, UNHCR documentation, academic research, and survivor testimony, has worked hard to ensure that reality is preserved rather than lost. That work of remembering is itself a form of honoring what they endured. If this documentary helped you understand a piece of history you hadn't encountered before, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe for more carefully researched historical documentaries like this one. And please, leave a comment below sharing your thoughts, respectfully, and with the same care these stories deserve. Thank you for watching and for remembering.